I'm a professor in the Department of Cultural Anthropology and work a lot in East Asian Studies and in China. I'm welcoming you today to an event that's part of our Humanities Unbounded Lab, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation. And this year we have something called the Ethnography Workshop, which had its first year last year. And this year, because of everything that sort of happened beginning in 2002 and then into March and April, we've decided to sort of organize a lot of our events around the COVID moment and what it means to do ethnography when you can't do face-to-face ethnography. That's sort of been part of what we've been doing, but we've gone off in a lot of other different directions. And of course, the question of surveillance and surveillance regimes in big tech and digitality and race, as we know, since March has been a big part of public discussions in the US, in Europe, and in other parts of the world as well. So today, what we want to grapple with, we brought in three really wonderful scholars who are doing incredible work. And we want to grapple with a number of different sort of questions. One is the relationship between cybernetic capitalism and racial capitalism. We want to think about how states are working with tech firms to maintain racial hierarchies and citizenship, as well as labor markets, who is included in certain definitions of a citizen. We're interested in how the concept of digital enclosure helps us understand the situation in Xinjiang, China, and how this is producing new forms of capitalist accumulation and capitalist frontier making. We're interested in how this concept of digital enclosures helps us focus on how target populations get converted into data, while at the same time expropriating their labor and producing underclasses of dependent laborers. We're interested in the larger relationship between tech firms, what is being called cybernetic capitalism and racial capitalism, both racial capitalism as we're experiencing today, but also historically. And then we're also going to hear today how the emergence of things like electronic bracelets used first in the US-Mexico border and now in Europe are tracking migrants and creating borders, as Carolina Sanchez-Boe has put it, creating borders without fences and confinement without walls. So we have three speakers today. I'm going to introduce each one right before that they speak. We've asked them to talk for 15 minutes. We don't have a ton of time. After those three our three speakers speak, we have one of our fellows, Sophia Goodfriend, is going to pose one or perhaps two questions that each of them are going to speak about. These questions emerged from a seminar that we did on all three speakers' work last Friday. And then after that, we welcome you to post questions in the chat. Myself and Jun Cho, who's one of who's our graduate fellow assistant for the lab this year, is the two of us are going to try to be monitoring questions, and we want to then repeat those questions for our speakers to answer, rather than have actually call on people to speak. So I hope that's okay with everyone. So we have with us today Darren Byler. I'm going to introduce Darren a little bit later. Darren's going to go third today. We have Carolina Sanchez-Boe, who's in Paris right now, and thank you for joining us later in the day. And then we have Brian Jefferson, and Brian Jefferson is going to go first. So let me introduce Brian very, very quickly, and then we're gonna jumpstart this. Brian is an associate professor of geography and geographic information sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's the author of this absolutely wonderful book, Digitize and Punish, Racial Criminalization in the Digital Age. His work explores digital technology, the state, capitalism, and a lot of his publications have been working at the intersection of political geography and economies of digital carceral technology, focusing mostly on New York and Chicago. So I'm going to now welcome all three of you and turn it over first to Brian.
Thanks a lot, Ralph. It's great to be here. I wanted to get a screen share, please.
You should be a co-host.
Planning and designing different ethnographies in the future. So my work, as Ralph said, is at the intersection. I look at the state and race and capitalism. And originally my book was looking at criminal justice technology in cities and looking at the ways in which it was preserving racial criminalization. And more recently, I'm trying to look at these issues in a more general sense. So I've been reading a lot of cybernetic capitalism. And there's a lot of, I think scholars are starting to look at cybernetics more and more in recent years. Scholars in media studies and communication studies primarily. But what cybernetics is this weird transdisciplinary science of communication and control. And it really sets the sort of the basis for information society, the information age. And the sort of most general idea in cybernetics is the idea that animals and machines, or new machines, smart machines, what we call now, are able to survive or navigate their environment through information feedback loops. So in other words, for a human being, the human being sort of looks out in the world and you collect information about the weather, about who's outside, about where you're walking, how fast you're walking, et cetera, et cetera. And you modify your behavior to be able to negotiate your environment and to survive as an individual. So the sort of big idea in cybernetics was that humans are informational machines, but so are machines, or they both work through information feedback loops. So the first mechanical application of cybernetics and the new machines were by Wiener. It was anti-aircraft guns, which were able to use radar to detect German planes, predict where they're flying, do calculations to shoot a shell and knock them down. And this originally was for war, but Norbert Wiener, who I should have mentioned was in the previous picture, saw the implications for capitalism. And he saw the implications of having machines that were able to process information and adjust their behavior according to that information as having calamitous effects in capitalism and industrial capitalism. So the first sort of phase of studies on cybernetic capitalism focused on the problem of automation. And it was the idea that we still are, of course, grappling with now, was that these new machines would displace factory workers. In fact, in 1949, Wiener went to the United Auto Workers because he was already being solicited by businesses to create microcomputers for factories. So mass unemployment was seen as the big problem with Wiener's cybernetics. But then you get a second generation of people who look at cybernetic capitalism. And with the sort of main problem here is not the factory worker, but it's the immaterial worker, the digital laborer. And it's the idea that the ways that cybernetic capitalism evolved, yes, of course, we know we shifted factory production mostly to newly industrializing countries, especially in East Asia. But the idea is that eventually those will be automated. The new horizon of labor is the immaterial laborer, as Hart and Negri calls them, or people who work on computers all day. And we, of course, either write our articles or we provide services in the service sector. And for most of the mostly Anglo-European theorists who are looking at cybernetic capitalism, they see this picture on the screen as sort of the horizon for all of labor, what they call homogenization of the labor process. But they also see the advent of personal computing as leading to the digital self. So for them, cybernetic capitalism is not only us working with our computers to create value, whether that's through writing articles or providing YouTube content, for instance, but also through our interactions with personal devices. And this is, of course, where the surveillance comes in. So a good example of the individual or digital self, you might read, I'm sure a lot of you have read it, Deleuze, right? And it's the idea that through our mobile phones and computer networks, the sort of new individual is controlled through, he says, control techniques, but mostly through a sort of, he says, nebulous form of power. So your credit score, your internet searching habits, your geolocation data, all become not only marketable or capitalizable. You could capitalize and send these personal data, sell them on the free market, but they also form what he calls this sort of modular form of control, where if your credit score gets too bad, you will adjust your behavior potentially. Or you know, if we search things on Google, we'll get advertisements, and that will affect our consumer behavior. Some of the advertisements will be geolocated, which will affect our mobility. So at the end of the day, for these sort of second wave of cybernetic capitalist theorists, the idea is that the ways that digital surveillance is going to effectuate power relations is by steering our behavior. And it's based on our free choices. You know, we have the free choice to use our credit card or to do a Google search or to walk down the street. And then it's taking the data from that and using it to sort of steer the individual subject. And for this sort of group of thinkers, the new subject of capitalism is the docile, sort of happy consumer who, you know, shops through the internet and gives private data to companies to use and to manipulate. So these are sort of these two phases of cybernetic capitalism. First, the factory, and then the immaterial labor, or the social factory, as Tronti, the Italian autonomous, call it. What I want to do is see what happens when we put this next to racial capitalism theory, these theories. And racial capitalism theory, I would say there are two main things to think about. One is sort of the way that racially denigrated or stigmatized people are forced into cheap labor markets or exploitable labor markets. And then two is to not be economically reductionistic, but to also see culturally or socially the way that minorities and stigmatized minorities are also the value of their labor, but also the value of their life is different. So they are much easier set to death without the sort of mainstream or majority mourning for their death, or being worried about their death, or being denied political rights. So the question for me is, if we go back and we look at the sort of immaterial laborer, right, sort of making this homogenous universal statement that this is how people are being plugged into the cybernetic economy, I think is, it's a bit short-sighted, because with racial capitalist theory, we might think more of, well, maybe the factory workers in Shenzhen, or we might think of the miners in Congo, or, you know, the used mobile phone recyclers in Ghana, right, for instance. They have a much different position within the cybernetic economy, and for the most part, they've been overlooked in this body of work. So I've been reading a lot of stuff recently, and I typically do US, but in my work, I'm trying to do more transnational stuff, which is another reason I'm really happy to be here. But just very quickly, in looking at some of the works, there are, of course, more works on the borders being transformed through information communication technology, and looking at how stigmatized laborers are being controlled, not only tracked across the border, but also tracked when they work in farms, and to sort of keep this constant tab over this very cheap migrant labor force within the US and even on the other side of the border. This pictures, these dots are actually fusion centers. So after the war on terror, data fusion centers were one of the big sort of new institutions. And what they do is they share information of not only suspected terrorists, but also criminals between local authorities, state authorities, and federal authorities, and actually other foreign governments as well. And so in this sense, you know, you have the dangerous other who is constantly surveilled by this network of data centers. And then what my work looked at, or my book looked at, is of course urban centers. And the argument in New York and Chicago is, in specific, the de-skilled, deindustrialized workers, overwhelmingly workers and public workers who lost their jobs during neoliberal retrenchment. In both cities that I study, they're disproportionately Black and Latinx. So this is a picture of a real-time crime center. And what I try to argue in my book is it becomes almost like a warden. If you think of a warden in a prison, you imagine exporting that warden into cities through these real-time crime data centers. So these sort of hidden dimensions of cybernetic capitalism, I think there are three things that I'm looking at, and they seem to overlap with definitely Darren and Carolina's work in some way. Of course, there are different cases with their own specificities, but generally, we're looking at, well, I'm looking at, I should say, but material and de-skilled workers. So not the immaterial worker on the computer, but perhaps the person who builds the computer or digs up the minerals for building the computer, or refurbishes or recycles the computer, right? And or de-skilled workers, sort of in the people who were not able to transition from the industrial economy to the new digital economy. So that's sort of one dimension. The second is that in cybernetic capitalism, it's very Foucauldian, and it's the notion that this new form of power is predicated on the freedom of the individual, right? So you're free to use your cell phone and to call who you want to call, or buy what you want to buy, or search what you want to search. And the idea is that that is the basis upon which data and information is accumulated. And that is what's taken by not only private personal data swapping firms, but also by governments. And then the third is that I'm trying to look, but I should say the old sort of cybernetic capitalism idea is the subject is free, and their freedom is what power acts upon. But in what I look at, and I think what Carolina and Darren look at, is predicated on relative non-freedom. So again, I think it's another example of a sort of universalizing, in this case, you know, a middle class sort of person in the mainstream. And making our general statements about cybernetic capitalism by only putting them, thinking about their struggles with the system. And then third, of course, is how ICT and how the industry profits, and how are there incentives for having specific surveillance systems for either the material, the de-skilled, or the non-citizen. And I think that what you're seeing from all across disciplines are, we're all like sort of starting to excavate these things. And that's why I think it's exciting to be able to talk across disciplines, because different people are doing it with different terminology, but you get a sense that there's a common sort of research agenda that's emerging. So just in closing, this is work that I'm doing now. It's not done. I don't have all my thoughts really together on it, but two research questions that I'm looking at, and happy to listen to others, is sort of how do our everyday uses of these devices prop up this other hidden side of cybernetic capitalism? So this is where I think covert surveillance really comes in to play, where in some cases in US cities, the struggle is to make sure that the state doesn't get access to the Bluetooth beacon data and the the geolocation data. And then what ways, if any, are these struggles over racial surveillance and data privacy converging? So in other words, the overwhelming amount of work within what we broadly call cybernetic capitalism, it often revolves around data privacy issues, which obviously are very important, but how can we sort of fuse those concerns with also the concerns of immigrants, of stigmatized minorities, and et cetera. So those are just sort of the considerations that I'm looking at. But I'd be interested to learn how to do this ethnographically, actually, by listening a lot. So thanks.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Brian, for launching us off. Okay, we're going to move immediately to our next speaker. And those of you who have just joined us in the last few minutes, we're going to hear from Carolina Sanchez-Boe, and then Darren Byler. And we're going to have some questions that are going to be posed that we've already come up with. And then we're going to open it up to questions in the chat. So we encourage you, if anything pops into your head as Brian just spoke, or as Carolina and Darren speak, please drop your question into the chat. So I'm really thrilled to have Carolina Sanchez-Boe here with us. I sort of met her through a Guardian article that she and Darren recently published, and we're going to share that. I think Jim just shared that in the chat. People can take a look at that if when you have time. She is both a sociologist and an anthropologist, and is currently the Danish with the a postdoc with the Danish Research Foundation at Aarhus University, and is affiliated with the University de Paris, as well as the John Jay Center for Criminal Justice at CUNY. Her research project, Borders Without Fences, Confinement Without Walls, focuses on the use of electronic monitoring for border control purposes. And her broader research, which really spans 20 years or more in both France as well as in New York City, centers on the anthropology of confinement, deportation, illegalization, bordering practices in prisons and urban spaces. And again, as I said, focusing mostly on the US and France. She's worked with a number of nonprofits, and I think even when she was doing a lot of her work in detention centers in New York, if I recall correctly, she was working as a paralegal assistant with people who had been detained. She's worked with lots of different nonprofit organizations. And most excitedly to say is that her book, which I've been eagerly anticipating, called The Undeported, is now forthcoming from Roman and Littlefield, hopefully very early in 2021. So Carolina, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you for introducing me to Brian, whose book I've been wanting to read for a very long time, but sadly, it's very difficult to get books right now because of the restrictions and the confinement here. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I'm going to share my screen as well. Does this work?
Yeah, great.
And I think that Brian's absolutely right. I think that we're looking at many of the same things, not necessarily with the same discipline or the same terminology, but I do believe that we're looking at a lot of the same phenomena. I was going to say, in this time of closed borders, it's so lovely to be in a setting like this and to be able to feel less isolated. You know, the universities are closed here, we're in lockdown, we can't go out between 9 o'clock and 6 in the morning. We have to download an app and we can only go out for 1 hour a day. So it's really refreshing to be able to share with colleagues across the Atlantic. So in this presentation, I wish to discuss my project on the spread of electronic monitoring, an alternative to immigration detention in the US. I'm working on a project which looks at electronic monitoring for border control purposes in France, Denmark, and the US, but I'll focus on the US here. The project is called Borders Without Fences and Confinement Without Walls. And it studies the for-profit and humanitarian motives behind the use of electronic surveillance for internal border control, as well as the ways in which these new technologies of confinement are experienced and embodied when border control is ensured in the most intimate spheres, in homes and on bodies. So let me see if this works. So I've used collaborative audio-visual methods to study surveillance and digital confinement for internal border enforcement. And I'll talk a bit about the changes that I've encountered this time of COVID. So for the past, this is the device, and this is me doing fieldwork in Austin, Texas last year, which I haven't been able to continue this spring. For the past 2 decades, and as an anthropologist and a paralegal lawyer and activist, I've been working on the entanglements of criminal justice and immigration enforcement in France and the US. And my main focus has been on what I call the undeported, a floating population, as Foucault would say, foreign nationals who experience forced movement between institutions and situations of confinement, such as incarceration, detention, and undocumented status. And I focused mainly on the greater Paris and New York areas. So this is a prison I studied in France. And those of you who have read Discipline and Punish will recognize the black and white photograph of the prison. Today, the individual boxes have been taken out, but the whole is still in use today. And the anti-suicide nets that you can see in the middle testify to the terrible conditions of confinement that are present in this prison that is more than 100 years old. So throughout my research, I've been interested in resistance against surveillance within institutions of confinement and against deportation. But it was mostly the kind of immediate human surveillance by immigration officers, guards, and other street-level bureaucrats that could be circumvented, as those of you who have read my work will know. This is an immigration detention center I started in Elizabeth, New Jersey, where incoming asylum seekers who are apprehended at the JFK or Newark international airports are being held in a former warehouse while their asylum case is being processed. So Elizabeth is known for its terrible conditions of detention as well, and has also been used to detain New Yorkers whose deportation case was pending. In 2011, 2 of my research participants were among the first undeported New Yorkers to be placed under electronic monitoring as an alternative to detention in a program called ISAP, the Intensive Supervision Appearance Program. So I'd like to speak quickly about Ravi Rakbir, who was the first person I met who had experienced this device. And he was explaining that, so I'm reading from my slide, but the monitor would be on my foot. Once a month, I had to go to a place and report in. Officers could come into my home unannounced. Initially, I was really happy to be free, so to be released from detention. But there's a curfew, and then you still have to live under this threat that every day you can be deported. It's really harsh. In detention, you're fighting the system, and you're fighting with whatever resources you've got. With a bracelet, how are you going to live? Dealing with everyday life, and on top of that, you can get deported. It makes it extremely difficult. Like when I got married, my wife and I, we had just got married and we were looking for a place to eat driving on the highway. I didn't know we had crossed the border to another county, but the GPS did, and the ankle bracelet said, "You are exiting your master zone. You are exiting your master zone." My foot started talking to me. It turned out we had changed counties. Afterwards, for 3 days, I lived under the guillotine that they will violate me and take me back in, that you have violated a border. It's a fear. And I said, someone in France described it to me as a prison without walls. And Ravi said, it is a prison without walls. It's an even much harsher prison. Sorry, the walls close in upon you. So while Ravi and another research participant described their experience as highly intrusive, their experience of electronic monitoring is highly intrusive, many of my friends and my colleagues who are immigration lawyers or human rights activists saw the deployment of electronic monitoring as a welcome alternative to the terrible hardships of immigration detention. This resonates with the deployment of electronic monitoring as an alternative to incarceration. I want to go back in time a little bit to tell you about the development of this particular surveillance technology. In 1977, Judge Jack Love, a New Mexico District Court judge, read a Spider-Man comic where the Kingpin strapped a transmitter on Spider-Man's wrist in order to track the superhero anywhere he went. Judge Love found that the similar transmitter could help relieve jail and prison overcrowding, and he convinced a company, BI Incorporated, from Denver, Colorado, to develop a similar device. In the US since 2004, electronic monitoring has been used for immigration control purposes, and it's been promoted as a more humane and a more cost-effective alternative to immigration detention. So it's been promoted both by human rights defenders and for-profit corporations in a very rare alliance. No human rights defenders would ever advocate for opening more prisons or more immigration detention facilities, but many have advocated for the use of electronic monitoring for border control purposes. Just as in the criminal justice system, electronic monitoring has become an addition rather than an alternative to detention. The graph shows how so-called alternatives to detention have not decreased the number of persons detained, but rather people who would otherwise never have been detained are now being monitored. ICEP started with so-called criminal deportees, the worst of the worst, foreign nationals who have committed misdemeanors or crimes in the country, but has now expanded to asylum-seeking women apprehended at the southern border, often with gendered ideas about it being better to submit women to more humane forms of confinement. With the immigration backlog, they end up being monitored for months and sometimes years. BI Incorporated is now owned by Geo Group, one of the world's largest prison and detention contractors, and it now profits from both the expansion of detention and of alternative to detention, as it did the expansion of prisons and probation. Whether migrants are detained or whether they're monitored, Geo Group makes a profit. If ICEP were a true alternative to detention, two of Geo Group's sources of income would be in direct competition. In 2017, a Geo report announced that new ICE contracts for electronic monitoring increased revenues by 33%. And I'm quoting one of the reports they did to their shareholders, sorry. And they said it has constituted milestones that have paved the way for continued positive momentum for our company. So I'm now midway in my presentation, and I'd like to show you a short rough cut from a documentary that I'm currently finishing with Jesse Rodriguez, who's an Austin-based videographer. So I'll see if I can figure out to change. There you go.
Yeah, we're not seeing the screen.
You're not seeing the screen?
We're not seeing the video.
Oh, sorry.
It seems like we're hearing it.
You're hearing it. I'm sorry about that. I thought it would be easier to go from one to the other. Maybe I need to. How can I do this? Maybe like this. So sorry about that. I thought it would be much more smooth. Can you see it now?
These bruises are just because of that material allergy. No. This allergy is just because of that. Yeah, when I was in.
Does it work now?
Not yet.
Share your screen again.
Oh.
Easy to go outside. So they were releasing me, and at that day, they put ankle monitor on my foot. And I was surprised because
There it is. There it is.
About that, like, you're gonna get this too. But last time when I was going outside, so they put on my feet, in my foot, and I was scared. And I said, "What is this?" Because it was blinking the light in there. I was scared. I said, "What is this? I'm not criminal." So they said that, but it's important. You have to wear it. So and you have to go to the ICE also. So we'll let you know that when you can get rid of it. So not yet. So I said, okay. So I went to outside and I was with my kids, and my kids were so scared that why you have this, Mom? And I was scared also that I don't know, I'm not criminal, but they gave it to me, very big in the foot, and it has a green light blinking every time. And when battery is not charged, so it's the red light is blinking. So then we know that battery is going to be low, so then we're going to change the battery also. Yeah, it happened with me first one time that I forgot to charge my battery, and I went on my job, and it was giving very bad sound. battery low, battery low. It was very bad sound coming out from my foot. And people were looking at me, what is this? Like how she's, from where this sound is coming out, that battery low, these recharger battery low. So I was scared that what is this? Like I'm feeling embarrassing, like everyone is looking at me. And I was working there on the food truck, and my owner, he was looking that he said that what is this? This is not good. That customer are looking at you. So I said, I'm sorry, I forgot to charge my battery.
You know, that's the experience that we have, right? Is that people feel like these ankle shackles is what they call them. They further the stigma, right, of people, right? It's kind of like having to wear your prison jumpsuit out in the world.
So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint, if I can figure it out. Does this work?
It's coming.
I'm so sorry for the non-smooth transition.
We all have these problems when we do this. It started to screen share, but we're not seeing your PPT.
Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Oh.
Caroline, sorry to interrupt. You may have to stop sharing the video first.
Okay.
Then reshare the PowerPoint.
Thank you so much for helping me. I'm very technologically challenged. So let's see. Does it seem to work?
We're just getting a black screen from you.
Oh. Hold on, let me try again. I'm very sorry about this. I'll try to shorten my presentation afterwards to be more brief. Does this work? Because it,
there we go. You're good.
Good. Thank you.
This is Zoom life. We all deal with this.
Oh, thank you for your patience. Well, so the woman who you saw briefly at the end, you just saw her from behind. You saw her ankle monitor. You saw her going out of a electronic staircase. She's also here walking into the GEO office in San Antonio, Texas, and she's an asylum seeker from a Central American country, and I'll call her Lilia. So in July 2019, when I met her, she told me, she said, I think that through my griete, so griete means ankle shackle, and it's commonly used by Spanish speakers to describe electronic monitors. She said that I think that through my griete, ICE follows where I go and where other asylum seekers go, so that they know where undocumented migrants meet. That way they can arrest more undocumented migrants. And when she said this, I didn't contradict Lilia, but I thought to myself, of course, ICE could do this, but there hasn't been a case yet where ICE has arrested undocumented migrants after surveying asylum seekers who were monitored. I actually always think of myself as a little too paranoid when it concerns surveillance, but it soon turned out that Lilia was right and that I was wrong. So 3 weeks after Lilia told me how she thought that undocumented migrants were, sorry. Oh, I'm missing a slide here. I shared the wrong one, I'm sorry. But 3 weeks after Lilia told me that she thought ICE was collecting evidence through GPS monitoring to arrest undocumented migrants, the Mississippi raids happened, considered by many to be the largest immigration raids in recent US history. When I read the sworn statements supporting the search warrants that led a judge to authorize immigration raids of hundreds of poultry workers in Mississippi, which is available online, it turned out that ICE had been using information extracted from the electronic monitors of 3 women from Guatemala to prepare the raid. And I wanted to show you the affidavit so you sort of could follow some of it. But it reads, queries of the historical GPS coordinates associated with Carmelina X's electronic monitoring bracelet revealed numerous daily captured coordinates located within the Food Incorporated processing plant in Morton, Mississippi. The statement shows us the working hours of the women and implicitly their work conditions. For example, it reads that on July 26, 2019, at approximately 4:43 a.m., Carmelita arrived at the Food Incorporated processing plant and remained at the Food Incorporated processing plant until approximately 1:17 p.m. So the ICE officers were monitoring these women through the electronic monitoring bracelets and discovered that they would be working shifts of 8 hours, often in the middle of the night, and were able to uncover a place where a lot of undocumented migrants were working. The affidavit also showed that one woman had arrived in the US in 2014 and the others in 2017, and that they had been concerned by JPS. They had been monitored through ankle bracelets for 5 and 2 years respectively before the extracted data was used to arrest them and hundreds of other people. And the affidavit showed how one of the women, Julissa, had been de-escalated to Smartlink. So I'm quoting de-escalated in February 2019, which leads me to speak of this new alternative to the alternative, which is the use of facial recognition software as an alternative to detention. So on this slide, Lorena, who's an asylum seeker who has fled violence in Guatemala, is guiding me through Smartlink, the facial recognition software that BI Group has installed on her mobile phone. And Lorena was initially relieved that her ankle monitor was removed until she was required to give ICE access to her email account, which connects to her social media accounts. When I took this picture and took this footage, we were at her lawyer's office in Austin, Texas, and it was in November 2019. And she explained to me how once a week she checks in by taking a photograph of herself on her telephone. She has to have her phone turned on at all times with the GPS on, and she knows that ICE can follow her every step. She also worries that ICE may surveil social media, her texts, and the photographs of her family and friends. So to conclude, to finish, the interviews and use of audio-visual method that were possible before 2020 are no longer possible for me. The borders are closed for me, and they have been closed since March. And I have not been able to travel to the US, and I don't know when that can be possible again. Today, contacts to my research participants are reduced to communications through their cell phones, which are also the device through which they're being monitored by ICE. I've always communicated a lot with my research participants through regular phone conversations, chats, email, WhatsApp, or social media, and I've continued to do so. Compared to 20 years ago, new communication technologies offer new ways of feeling close and connected. I've written about taking part in social movements from afar, but I can also mention how I've recently sadly been invited to my first COVID-related funeral on Facebook with participants from the US and Honduras. Most research participants who are in the images that I've shown you have become friends and often call me to chat, tell me that they've obtained asylum, that they have found jobs as cleaners in the emergency rooms of Austin hospitals, or that they finally saved enough money to buy a car, becoming delivery persons for Amazon, a company that thrives and hires in these times of lockdown, and a company that has also been very involved with ICE. I'm still able to learn about the ways in which COVID influences their daily lives, their fears, their health, their families, their labor. Implicitly, I'm also learning about their fear of surveillance, as we rarely speak about what initially brought us together. Some mentioned the film and are looking forward to its release, but I've noticed that we no longer continue our conversations of surveillance, the ones we had before the Mississippi raids and before our communication became digital only. This situation reminds me of conducting fieldwork in institutions of confinement, such as prisons and detention, where everyone is always cautious about surveillance. It's probably a research result by and of itself that we feel digital enclosures so strongly today as researchers, but what I'd love to do would be to ask you for advice on fieldwork ethics and methods when contacts to research participants are reduced to communications that are very likely being monitored. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I apologize for the technical problems, and I thank the person who was kind enough to advise me and guide me through the screen sharing. And I look forward to the continuous discussion.
Thank you very much. That was Ren Hai from the University of Arizona Anthropology Department, my old classmate at the University of Washington. That was helping you out there. So thank you, Ren Hai. And Carolina, thank you very much. That was great. I know I have a lot of questions. I'm not seeing any in the chat yet, so I want to again encourage you all to feed us some questions. So we're going to move now to Darren Byler, who I also have a connection with through the University of Washington Anthropology Department, where he got his PhD. Darren's now a postdoc fellow at the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, but is in Seattle, as you might expect. Everything is online. Darren researches the dispossession of ethno-racial Muslim minorities through forms of surveillance and digital capitalism in China and Southeast Asia. His first book, Terror Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossession and Masculinity in a Chinese City, is forthcoming from Duke University Press, I believe in January 2021, which examines emerging forms of ethno-racialization, capitalism, and state power in the Uyghur region of Chinese Central Asia. He also has a second book, which I believe is under contract with Columbia, called Technologies of Re-Education, which considers the social life of surveillance technologies in China and in other places around the world. So Darren, it's all yours. Thanks for being with us. You're muted. There you go.
There we go. Sorry about that. The screen share thing made the interface a little off kilter. Well, it's really an honor to be here. My book won't be here till August, but it's still in time for teaching next year. And Brian's book is available open access, which is how I first came across it. So Carolina no longer has any excuse not to read it, because everyone can read it and teach it. It's really excellent. I think it's there in the chat. What I want to talk about today is Enclosure as capitalist frontier making and work through that in the context of Northwest China. But to kind of help us understand what that means, I want to first sort of explain my terms. How does Enclosure work as capitalist frontier making? So Enclosure, as is often talked about in Marxian theory, is related to material enclosure, to original accumulation or primitive accumulation, as it's often defined by Marx. And he's looking at 18th, 19th century England and a process of turning land that was held in common into a new space that was captured by a legal regime of property ownership that pushed people, mostly peasants, off their land into wage labor in factories, and the way that it utilized forms of infrastructure, fencing, roads, transportation, housing around factories, all those things to make this process work. Oftentimes, Marxist theorists think about this as a moment in time, an event that happened long ago. But when we think with someone like Cedric Robinson, who's talking about racial capitalism, we have to understand that this is not something that's in the past, but something that's ongoing and that is central to capitalism itself. My work is really engaged with scholars that are taking up Robinson's framing to think about how capitalism and colonialism are actually co-constructed. That colonialism is sort of the frontier edge of capitalism as it moves in the world, and how it targets ethno-racial others in general in a whole variety of places. There's a specific way that we can think about enclosure beyond the material though, and that's really what I want to focus on here. And that's how digital enclosure moves in a process to a second enclosure process to capture social relations and the human mind, thinking itself, to extend the logic of the factory and the workhouse, at least for some people, into all of the other spaces of social reproduction, to leisure, consumption, domesticity. And digital enclosure, that term is actually coming from this scholar here, Mark and Grehovich. It's a really excellent article from 2007. So how does this all work in China and Northwest China? Well, to understand what's happened to the Uyghurs, which is a group of around 12 million indigenous folks in Northwest China, we have to go back to the 90s, which is when China was opening up to the West. was becoming a manufacturer for the world and needed raw materials to drive that new economy. And one of the ways that they did this was to send large numbers of settlers to Northwest China as migrants. People, they went of their own free choice to find work, but were incentivized by the state to go there. And when they arrived, they began to build out the hard infrastructure in southern Xinjiang, which is down here and is the Uyghur homeland, to extract natural resources. This land is the site of around 20% of Chinese oil and natural gas, an even larger percentage of coal, the sort of energy sources that are necessary for industrial production. This had a major effect on the Uyghur society. It pushed people off of their land and also began to exclude them in certain ways because they weren't given jobs in the new economy. Those jobs went to the settlers that were coming from other parts of China. And so it began to push people into forms of wage labor as sort of tenant farmers, often in cotton production. And over time, the last 2 decades, Xinjiang has come to produce around 84% of Chinese cotton and around 1/4 of the world's tomatoes. A lot of that's being farmed by Uyghurs who are sort of in this tenant. It's also pushed lots of young Uyghurs off of their farmland and into forms of migration into cities. And one of the ways that migration was fostered was through digital infrastructure, which arrived around 2010. This was the first time that Uyghurs began to use smartphones. So when I did my first year of fieldwork in 2011, this is what everyone was looking at and talking about was, what smartphone do you have? How are you using it? A new app called WeChat had just come online, which was replacing outlawed apps like Facebook and Twitter in China. And it really opened up Uyghur society to the world because for the first time, Uyghurs could get online and they could use oral speech to communicate with each other. And for a short window of time, for about 3 years, the state really wasn't able to fully censor what they were saying. So they were actually using Uyghur language to kind of hack the censorship infrastructure in China. And that allowed them to talk about religion, talk about politics, but also just to organize themselves. So when I did my second year of fieldwork, I saw people organizing themselves using WeChat, oftentimes in relation to a mosque community in the city. They would see this mosque space though as not the site of real Islam. Real Islam was happening online. It was happening through digital recordings that were being shared, oftentimes from teachers outside of China, sometimes inside China, and was being shared on their phone through WeChat, through Bluetooth technology, through SD cards, all of those things. People didn't have a very strong understanding of the digital footprint that they were leaving behind as they were doing all of this. It just felt like there's this new space of opportunity and freedom to talk about things that matter to them. That began to change in May of 2014 when the state declared the People's War on Terror. This was in response to several ISIS-style attacks that happened in eastern China, first in Kunming and then in Beijing. The People's War on Terror, went after people that carried out violence, but it also extended much further. It began to target anyone who appeared to be pious in their Islamic practice. That was now discussed as extremism and as something that needed to be eradicated, something that needed to be transformed. It was something that produced a kind of detainability, which is something that Carolina talks about in her work. So it also inspired a digital enclosure process. So it was already underway before the war was declared, but it really accelerated it, bringing state security and private industry together in new ways through billions of dollars of investment in building safe city projects and hiring a whole army of people that I refer to as data police that began to implement the enclosure system. The initial goal of the system was really to break the autonomy of the Uyghur internet. They just didn't want people to use it as freely as they were. But over time, it became this enclosure system. A couple examples of the kinds of technologies that they adapted or built was a tool to automate the transcription and translation and assessment of Uyghur speech. So the way that they were using WeChat before, the oral communication, that was no longer possible. They also, a whole range of companies are now trying to automate a kind of racialization of Uyghur and Kazakh faces to detect them based on the phenotypes of their face. They're not fully successful, I think, in doing that yet, but that's a process that many of the computer vision companies are trying to do. So who are the data janitors or data police that implemented the system? Here I'm thinking with Lily Irani's work on data janitors, where she talks about how almost all AI systems are built by low-wage workers, often those in South Asia who are hired through Mechanical Turk, which is an Amazon platform, to actually train the AI systems how to detect things. They're like looking at a picture of a couch and identifying the pillows on the couch over and over and over again, and they're not being paid much at all to do that work. So having human labor involved in building an AI system is actually quite common. In this context, the data janitors become they become data police. This is one of the people that I write about, a guy named Bymarat, who's now in Kazakhstan, who was hired to be kind of what he thought of as sort of mall security, as a sort of private security job. He thought it seemed like it paid really well, and he was unemployed, which is the case for lots of Uyghurs and Kazakhs. Initially, he was put into a People's Convenience police station, which they had built in the end of 2016 and 17, which is really a surveillance hub in a grid of a policing system. So each urban area, well, even the county's rural areas, are divided into grids. And these People's Convenience police stations are responsible for what happens inside that grid. So there's these stations here, and there's checkpoints around them. The data police are charged with sorting the population as they go through the checkpoints. So in this one, there's 2 lines that are for Uyghurs and 1 green lane, which is for people that appear to be Han. And so the data police are just sorting the population, saying if you're Han, you can go through this green lane. If you're Uyghur, you have to go through the Uyghur lane. When the person gets to the front of the line, they have their face scanned and then matched to the image that's on their ID. And the data doors that are associated with this checkpoint also check the MAC address of their phone. So they're using multiple identifiers to make sure that this is the person at this point in time and place moving through this checkpoint. About 6 months into his job, Bymarat was given one of these devices, which is a device that does digital forensics. You plug it into someone's smartphone and it scans through the phone in a matter of minutes, maybe 1 minute or less, looking through for around 70,000 different items that are associated with pre-criminal or religious behavior. He didn't know what these things did at first, but it became pretty apparent pretty quickly. It gives a reading of the person's device as either green, yellow, or red. Green means okay, yellow means you should check the person, and red means that this person should be detained immediately. And a lot of the things that showed up for the red readings were the things that are highlighted here in yellow. Like this person had gone to the mosque regularly. They had pictures of people wearing hijabs or beards of younger people. They had contact with people in Muslim majority countries, or they had listened to unauthorized religious teachings, had been a member of a religious study group on WeChat, or had studied a foreign language or used a VPN or a banned app. Those are the sorts of things that would show up in this device. He said that they would scan people all day long, every day, and they were supposed to really target particular populations of people, which is mostly young Muslim men. Initially, he didn't know that the people that were being detained or had that red signal attached to them through the scan were being sent to camps. He thought that they were just going to schools, which is what they were told. But then later on, he actually was charged with transferring detainees from a detention center to a camp, and he realized that this is really a carceral space because there was all kinds of sort of non-lethal weapons that people were carrying. They were shackled. They had blindfolds on. And it was a whole range of people, from the very old to the very young. There were people that he knew in the groups of people that were being transferred. And so it was very clear to him that the schools were actually prisons. They weren't schools as the state had told him. Around 2018, a new development happened where factories started to be built and operationalized in conjunction with the camps. Oftentimes the camp is immediately adjacent to the factory. Sometimes it's across town. But it's all over the region at this point. Most of the former detainees are put to work in garment manufacturing, which makes a lot of sense because cotton is one of the major crops in the region. And so centralizing cotton manufacturing there, or textile manufacturing there, makes good sense. There's also a rising cost of labor in Eastern China, which is already sending jobs to Vietnam and to Bangladesh. But now there's this new subject population, these people that are coming out of the camps that can be put to work in factories as well. One of the people I interviewed was this woman, Gulzira Al-Khan, who's now in Kazakhstan, but had gone back to China to care for her ailing mother, and was found guilty of watching Turkish TV shows where people wore hijabs, and of traveling to Kazakhstan and having a passport. After she was held for about a year in the camp, which was a really horrific experience with beatings, had to use a toilet inside which was just a bucket inside their cell. It was really crowded. Anyway, she was traumatized by that experience, but coming out of that, she thought maybe now things will be better. But a week later, she was sent to work in this factory by the local authorities. And this factory is around 7 kilometers from the camp where she had spent the past year. It was somewhat better than the camp. It wasn't as crowded, the food was better, but it was still a carceral space. This was her boss in the new factory. He had come to select her as a worker in the camp. She found out later. She had seen him in the camp, and he had picked her. She was put to work in the factory and was paid a little bit. She was paid around $50 per month, which is 1/6 of the minimum wage in the region. And on top of that, given a sort of piecemeal rate of 1.5 pennies per pair of gloves. At the same time as she was being paid almost nothing, the factory was producing $6 million in sales. And most of the gloves that they were making were being sold abroad, mostly in Russia and Eastern Europe. So just to conclude, what's happening in that factory space is people are still being held in a kind of detention. She was saying that every day they would be scanned 3 times at least. Their phone would be scanned. They had body searches as they left. They weren't allowed to leave the factory grounds or the dormitory where they were held at night. And so she felt like, I was still fully unfree, that it's an open prison space. But still she was being put to work. And so what we're seeing here is something that's a little different than how these forms of surveillance have worked in other spaces. Like in Brian's work, people are being banished to prisons and to ghettos, or in Carolina's work, they're being deported. Here, something else is happening. Private tech is building a matrix of assessment, removal, and control, which is similar, but the difference is that private manufacturers are using this matrix to hold a targeted population in place and through that producing a class of unfree workers that have no possibility of organizing as a class for themselves. And so it's producing a kind of re-education labor regime. There's some important caveats to this in terms of how it could be transferred to other spaces. As for now, it looks as though the system requires this army of unfree data police to sort of man the system, to make sure it works, to train it. It doesn't seem as though it could just be, plopped into another place and made to work there. There's also checkpoints that have to be put in place, and the threat of the camps is really what makes any sort of movement towards political freedom seem impossible. As Gulzira was told over and over that if she doesn't work as she's supposed to, she'll be sent back to the camps. So I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions and look forward to the conversation.
Great, fantastic, Darren. Thank you so much for that, incredibly informative. So I'm now going to introduce you to Sophia, a good friend who is one of our PhD students in the Cultural Anthropology department, who's going to open up the questions. Sophia.
Hi, everyone. And yeah, thank you to all three of you for those really exciting and invigorating talks. I'm just going to pose one of the questions that we collectively, all of the fellows and the faculty in the ethnography lab, were discussing when we read over all of your work last Friday. So it begins with one of Darren Byler's papers that we read for this event, and his discussion of surveillance, which is a term that has been historically invoked to redistribute power within the surveillance encounter. Those being surveilled are aware of it and can act accordingly, subverting the system from within. We also see this idea in a different form in Carolina Sanchez-Boe's work, and Brian Jordan Jefferson's work is much more focused on technical infrastructures that exact surveillance and control over populations. As you write in his book, punitive web technology keeps the negatively racialized poor in the cities, but they must remain apart from the centers of conspicuous consumption, labor markets, leisure, residences, and wealth. Criminalized subjects get ensnarled, he writes, in something like a low-intensity form of a Agamben state of exception. So between these various approaches, there seems to be a tension between complete carceral control and the subversive power to resist digital enclosure. And we were wondering how each of you understand the relationship between digital enclosure and resistance, and if resistance is even the right term here.
So anyone, either of you can just jump in and take that up. Although we'd like all three of you to reflect.
Yeah, well, I guess we could just go back in order. But definitely resistance, it's something that I think even this panel is sort of representative of, I think, almost a sort of critical mass of people resisting, and scholars and also legal practitioners and civil rights activists thinking about ways of resisting. So I think there are a lot of ways in which you do see people resisting. So in the case of my work empirically, I've seen one thing in Chicago has been abolishing the gang database. Yeah, there's also been in Chicago the Citizens Data Project, which is the biggest police misconduct database in the country, supposedly, which is run by guerrilla journalists and also everyday activists. And then I would, say, well, at least with my work, in many ways, I would see the latest wave of BLM protests, the first wave as well, as resistance, not only just to police violence, but also it's increasingly with regard to racial surveillance. So you have in LA and in New York City, Stop Spying, so Stop LAPD Spying. In New York, it's called Stop the Surveillance, I forget, something project. So I do think there's a groundswell of resistance, and I definitely, personally, I think like the current generation of grad students, there will be, in terms of academia, a flood of work that's chronicling the resistance and I think analyzing it.
So for my part, I've always been fascinated by the way in which foreign nationals and often racialized gendered minorities are being targeted in different ways and are being identified in certain ways. And it often seems to be a laboratory for what happens next to the sort of more mainstream, more powerful population. I'm very inspired by James C. Scott's work. He's worked a lot on different ways of making populations legible, and on just the way that surnames were created and different kinds of ways of registering populations and individuals have been created, and different kinds of resistance towards that. And he has I'd say an optimistic viewpoint, which is that there's always resistance in different ways. In my own work, and I know that we've spoken about this with Darren, because in prisons and detention centers towards deportation, I've always found that people would try and resist, and it would always happen. And in the work that I'm conducting right now, and I've been conducting especially last year on electronic monitoring, what I found really harsh and difficult to see was that within the 10 years that I've known of electronic monitoring, and I've known people who have been submitted to it, people have become more and more atomized. So putting an electronic monitor on a woman who has just arrived to seek asylum in the US and who is very isolated is very different from putting an electronic monitor on somebody who has been de-legalized, who was a resident in the US before, who had a green card before, who has a family, who has a community, and who has lost the right to be in the US, but who can sort of mobilize a lot of other resources to resist the deportation that he's a subject of. Darren and I have spoken about how in our work we feel that there's kind of it seems that the how do you say this in English, that the possibilities are getting reduced, but it still happens, and it happens in a lot of different ways. And we can see how it's happening, for instance, in tech companies, that as soon as Amazon wanted to contract with ICE, for instance, and promote their facial recognition software called Recognition with a K to make it sound more efficient, tech workers from Amazon actually resisted that as well. And I've heard of examples of people who have deleted their own software that they had created for the company that they worked for, and they've deleted it because they didn't want it to be used for border control, for instance. A lot of tech workers come from immigrant families or from minority, racial and ethnic minorities, or are immigrants themselves, have traveled to the US to work. And so in some of the larger corporations who are doing digital surveillance now, there seems to be mobilizations by tech workers themselves as well.
Yeah, great question. So surveillance, I think, works in two ways, at least in Xinjiang. The first is that because of what the tools that they're using are digital and they're online, it means that researchers like myself and people that are much better at accessing digital materials than me can find access to them. And so that's actually allowed media, it's allowed researchers to respond in kind of real time to what's happening on the ground. We can use satellite imagery to see stuff being built. We can find the bid contracts. We can get government documents that are leaked digitally. And then we also, in some cases, what I'm working on right now is looking at the internal police documents of this system that have been leaked through ways that I'm not allowed to talk about. So that's one thing. There's a digital footprint that makes this available to research. On the ground in Xinjiang, there's less ways that people can resist. You would think that one way that they could just stop using their phones, but there's actually prohibitions on that. If you go through checkpoints and you don't have your phone with you and you had a phone registered to your person, it's a sign of suspicion. You might be okay if you do that a few times, but if you do it too often, they're like, why aren't you carrying your phone? You should carry your phone because they're tracking you with the phone. So you have to carry it, and you also have to perform. You have to do political speech acts that show your loyalty to the state, that you've embodied a kind of re-educated ethos. You're grateful, and so you're retweeting, or in this case, you're reposting things that the government officials in your local community have posted to show that you're on board with it. But that doesn't mean that people have stopped thinking. They are changing their behavior in some ways. It does affect them, but there's a lot of offline activity that isn't available to the surveillance systems yet. So one of the people I interviewed said, when they wanted to talk in private, they would go to a sauna or they would go to a park far away from everyone, and they would really talk. And I think a lot of people are talking offline. They're still, building the social relations that they need to sustain themselves to some extent. But those spaces of freedom to speak are becoming limited.
Great, thank you all. Sophia, I see two good questions, one from Miriam Durrani, and then a follow-up that's connected to that from Monica Leo. Do you want to read those out? Do you see those in the chat?
Yes, yeah, these are from a little bit earlier, but it's very pertinent to this conversation. So Miriam Durrani asked, speaking to Carolina's comment, I'd love to speak more about doing research with participants and or researchers as they/we are likely being surveilled. Miriam's research with Pakistani Muslim college students in New York City who are being surveilled by the New York City Police Department mirrors her own experience of being surveilled in the last few years by the right-wing media. I hadn't thought about these two issues in relation to each other, but Carolina's presentation is making me want to think about these together. I would love to think about this with all of the panelists. And then Monica is echoing this question regarding how to conduct research for scholars who would potentially work with participants under digital surveillance. What are some of the platforms / secure ways to circumvent state surveillance, especially with research on Uyghur human rights violations? And this is a very pertinent question today more than ever, as so much of ethnographic research is moved online. So I'll leave those to the panelists.
Carolina, do you want to start with that?
I'm sorry. I think it's, I mean, I've already said why it's a really important question for me as a researcher. And I also want to say that it's an important question right now as an engaged scholar who's taking a part in debates. In France last week, one of my colleagues was threatened with decapitation from the extreme right, and there's been a lot of the government has very actively supported the idea that critical race scholars who have been working on Islamophobia in France are directly responsible for some of the latest terrorist attacks we've seen in France. So there's actually in France right now an attack on academic freedom, and the threats have been made through Twitter. I'm mentioning this because I think that one of the ways out, one of the things that can give us hope is through alliances. In this specific case, my colleague Eric Vassin, who has been threatened with beheading, has gotten a lot of support from the academic community in France and also from other parts of the world through online petitions and through, just showing that people are there. But alliances also with sometimes community activists, sometimes lawyers, like really having a network of people who are also aware of these issues and who can help sometimes with legal stuff, to protect somebody who's being surveyed by extreme right, for instance, or sometimes journalists who can uncover this, who have other platforms than we do. So I'm thinking that for me, the key word is alliances. It's having alliances with people who are critical and who have other tools than we do to look at these things.
Yeah, in terms of, it's funny, I actually never thought about it that much, the researcher being surveilled, but like I've had interesting hits. I've had the National University of Defense Technology in China read my articles. I've had private military corporations. I could see them through academia at EDU. I've had the Gendarmerie and Coast Guard of Turkey read my articles. So it's not only thinking of fear. I mean, I guess I've been naive and haven't thought about it in respect to my individual self as the researcher. But I think another thing, a very interesting thing that happened, I did a talk it was in Amsterdam, and it was, a bunch of academics talking about digital surveillance. And there's this sort of older guy who looked out of place, and he was taking pictures of all of my slides. And when he left, they said, oh, he's actually part of the police force. So I think in addition to, of course, thinking about our own safety, another thing that's important is to think about the ways in which the research might be used to improve or optimize or expand the systems that we're talking about. And I don't know how you prevent that, but it's something that I think is worth thinking about when we do our work. How can what we discover be turned around. Another thing I would say in predictive policing, I wouldn't say this is because of definitely not me, but one of the sort of biggest critiques I got was from the co-founder of predictive policing, Predpol software company in California. And a lot of the earlier stuff I did on predictive policing was looking at how predictive crime software used geographic information to predict, originally it used demographic information and personal and biographical information to predict who was going to commit a crime in the future. And one of the things that the tech industry has done is they say we no longer use individual data, we use geographic information. But of course, in a racially stratified city, it really doesn't make a difference practically, but it's a little more politically correct. So I think your question is really important. I don't have an answer, but I think it's even, it's bigger than we might expect. But yeah.
Just to respond really quickly and build on what Brian's saying, in my work, it's important that I make clear what's happening in China is part of global phenomena, that it's related to the global war on terror, it's related to counterinsurgency theory. It's really showing, if counterinsurgency is taken to its logical end, what it produces, producing what's happening in Xinjiang. And so making those connections explicit is important. So as a way of heading off US policymakers, utilizing my research or the Xinjiang situation in general to promote forms of anti-Chinese racism, the trade war, all the stuff that the Trump administration has done relative to China. That's important. In terms of how people can push back against this, or how we can protect the people we interview, it's really hard, especially if they're in China, to protect them. So most of my work is with people that are outside of China, that are in Kazakhstan, that have managed to get across the border in some way. And there's a process of teaching people some, digital protection, how to use Signal, how to use a VPN, how to use the Tor network, things like that. And that doesn't always happen, but there is some of that that's going on. The other thing that Uyghurs and Kazakhs have done is they've just started using two devices. They have one device that they use to contact their family back in China that has WeChat on it, and they have another device, a clean phone, that they use for other purposes. So there's a bifurcation that they're doing to protect themselves and to protect their family members. And I think that's something that others could use that are in these kind of vulnerable situations.
I think one thing that we've been talking about, some of us here at Duke, is the question of, as we sort of take on some of these corporations and states where this stuff is happening, as academics that are affiliated with universities, what is the university responsibility for the researcher, right? And are they going to intervene if we, for example, would be arrested in either the US or someplace else? And so far, the Duke response has been mixed on this. It's not clear that they've come up with a policy. And I know other universities now are thinking about this because, as Brian was saying earlier, we are seeing so many grad students and a sort of new wave of young scholars that are no longer separating the activism from the academic work and that are diving head deep into this stuff. And this is going to become an issue. We have a great question from Pablo. Sophia, do you see that?
Yeah, so this is from Pablo Ruiz to Darren, but I think everybody can answer this as well. Is digital enclosure experienced as essentially different from non-digital enclosures? Thinking from Daniel Miller's idea of the digital/virtual as an integral part of everyday life, to what extent is stressing the digital aspect of enclosure masks the quotidian aspects of repressive systems? At the end of the day, the Xinjiang government has had to resource mass incarceration and not only selective detention based on digitally assessed criteria.
I can start. Not fully clear on all of what Pablo's getting after, but So of course there's a material aspect to what's happening. People are being put in prison at their real prisons. The digital is always there though, and it's not always clear, where the material and the digital, where the balance should be struck. What's happening in the camps is they're being run as smart camps, which means that people are being watched by cameras that are motion activated. Sometimes it looks like they're using face recognition. It's not always clear. But for most of the day, people are forced to sit on stools and they're being watched by these cameras. If they get up from their stools, then the guards will yell at them through a speaker system, get back on your stool. You have to ask permission to go to the bathroom. There's just like this virtual containment that's happening inside the prison itself, or inside the camp, which makes it kind of unique in that way. So the digital is happening there. It's not clear like if data harvesting is part of that, or if it's just a mode of control that means that you can have one guard that can watch several hundred detainees at once. In any case, it's disciplining people's bodies in a really strong way, which makes it, I think, different in some ways from other forms of incarceration, where there's, if people are constrained, physically constrained, that's one thing, but here they're forcing them to always make this mental choice to kind of hold their body a certain way for hours and hours at a time. So there are some ways that the digital, I think, affects people in these more intimate ways. It gets after the social reproduction of daily life that other forms of incarceration don't do. But I have to think a little bit more about that question. It's a good one.
Yeah, that question is one that it always frustrates me because I don't have a clear answer either. But I think between all three of our work, what's important is there is a notion, at least in a lot of the sort of stuff on digital technology and cybernetic capitalism, this idea that comes, of course, from Deleuze that enclosures are disappearing, and now it's all this decentered distributed power. And I think what our work all shows is that there is more dispersion of carceral power or state power, but it doesn't necessarily equate to the end of enclosures. So for like Carolina's work, right, you're looking at oftentimes people, they might have ankle bracelets, and if they go beyond a certain area that they're not allowed to be in, then that can lead to being captured and put in a detention. And for me too as well. So I look at ankle bracelets in New York City, and one of the things that they do is they have, it's called a geofence, which is essentially, you could think of it as like a circle in which if the person who has an ankle bracelet on, if they pass a certain longitude, latitude, then it will trigger an alarm to the nearest available patrol car. And they will be perhaps detained on the street, perhaps in the car, and then in some cases brought into a more traditional jail or prison. So I think the question about digital enclosures is a really great one, because it's tough because what we're seeing, at least with me, is that carceral power and surveillance is becoming more decentralized, but it can also, centralization and decentralization can move together. So if we don't have to think of it, I think, in a binary way, that digital technology only leads to more decentralization. It leads to new decentralization, forms of decentralized power, but also new forms of centralized power. So I guess the way I would look at it is maybe not constructing these two questions in sort of a binary way. But yeah.
It could be too that, to take Pablo to sort of think this a little bit differently, is that we need to ask, why is it that Daniel Miller and early people to this kind of research missed processes of data collection that were used for criminalization and incarceration and stuff like this? There was an absence in the literature for quite a while until very recently. Carolina, we want to give you the last word.
Well, it is a great question. It is an important one, but it seems that yeah, I mean, Brian is right in that it's not a binary, and there seems to be a lot of it's like a specter where you have like along different lines, racialized, gendered lines, different persons are experience capitalist extraction of their time. They experience sometimes detention, sometimes detainability, like the fear of being detained, sometimes prison, sometimes the fear of being incarcerated, sometimes insecurity, sometimes life-threatening, and sometimes death. But it's, yeah, sometimes it's, I mean, how can I put this? Having worked in different spaces of confinement, like physical walls, physical fences, and now working on these questions of more sort of digital enclosures. I mean, the bracelet is a very physical, very material thing that chafes and that bruises people. But facial recognition is much more dematerialized. I also feel that it's a spectrum of different, and that whether it's, how can I put this? That it's not so much whether it's material or it's not material, whether it's digital or not digital. What I find most important is what it does to people's experience of confinement and to the ways that their time and possibility to access different spaces is treated. I hope that was relatively clear.
So if I could maybe just keep people for a couple more minutes, my dear friend Carwyn Morris in London has just posted one last question. Sophia, do you see, or Carwyn, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I can unmute myself.
Do you want to read your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the talk, everybody. You might not have an answer to it. As a geographer myself, I was wondering how important is the capacity to manipulate and change the physical environment in the carceral regimes and regimes of surveillance you're discussing. I guess, for instance, land use rights in China are very different to land use rights in New York and Austin, and they enable different potentialities for surveillance. Because of this, for instance, with geofencing, is space bypassed in different ways using satellites because of these sort of land use regimes, or is there something else? Am I barking up the wrong tree? Just a quick question, thanks.
Well, I guess Carolina does, you do comparative, or you do multiple. I do all my stuff in the US, so I can't really speak on the differences nationally between land use. But I do think that the question of the physical infrastructure is really important. One of the things that I was looking at was the ways in which telecom companies worked with the New York city officials to, in the case of New York, lay the NYPD's own sort of proprietary fiber optic cable network. And for me, that was sort of this very American style public-private partnership, which, so that would be one case in the US. Also, using existing structures, refactoring them, or using them for different purposes is another thing that we see in New York and in Chicago. Older factories turned into data centers and things like this. But I'll defer to.
I was going to say that I do comparative work, but seeing you write, Carwyn, seeing you write land use, it just struck me that the people that I work with are people who have very little access to land use or to control of space, and that a lot of them have very limited space that they can move within safely. So some people have crossed borders to flee violence, persecution. Others experience a lot of potential police harassment or potential border guard harassment, or so the question of space for most of the people that I work with, whether it's in Europe or in the US, is that they have limited mobility spatially.
Just really quickly, in my context in Northwest China, because it was a site, it's become the site of the People's War on Terror. There's a kind of a state of exception that's opened up a military war space where a kind of disaster capitalism or war capitalism, a military industrial complex can develop. So that means there's sort of unlimited budgets for private-public partnerships to build safe cities, smart city projects. And this coincides with a sort of national push in China to develop AI technologies that are on par with or that surpass, Western companies like IBM or Google in terms of computer vision for sure, and also audio recognition, the Internet of Things. And they are actually already, I think, at least when it comes to face recognition, now leading the field. Safe city systems are data intensive, which means that they're the best place for a face recognition company to train their algorithms, because they're looking at so many faces all day, every day. So that's, I think, how it meets capital. And I think it's actually similar to how Palantir and other companies in the US are developing their algorithms here.
Yeah, okay. I think we've come to the end. We're at 3:10. One thing I just want to alert people to, of course, we all had probably a somewhat joyous or massively joyous Saturday when we had a new president-elect. I want to remind everybody there's already news that's breaking that the Trump administration is not only trying to sue to overturn the election, but is speeding up right now deportations from the US border back across the border, and that this is something that you can expect to see accelerate over the next month or 2 months until early January. Stephen Miller and others are behind this, and it's something that we should all be watching very, very closely. And Carolina, it'd be great, or if anyone else knows about organizations that are working really, really, really hard right now to sort of keep media attention on these mass deportations that the Trump administration is going to try to smuggle underneath our noses as we watch this sort of like election, the lawyers sort of step into the whole election process now. And anyway, in any case, there are many other struggles to keep paying attention to. We're going to try to get information about that and other stuff that anyone who joined today, or Darren or Brian or Carolina, if you want to share with us, we can put it up on our website that we're running. We will also talk to our speakers about whether it's okay to share the recording and all the great questions that came through the chat. And once we get permission from them, we will we'll make a decision about sharing the recording on the website. So I want to thank everybody who registered today. We had a really, really great crowd and excellent questions come through chat. I'm sorry if we couldn't get to all of them. And then especially to Carolina, to Brian, and to Darren, great presentations and fantastic engagement with the questions. I can't thank you enough on behalf of Anne and Jun and Emily and all the fellows, all 6 of the fellows, and our support staff. Thank you so much for joining us today and giving us so much to think about, and hopefully the questions and the conversation can keep going. So cheers. All right, thanks. Never know how to sign off of Zoom, so be well.